how would you like to be addressed by me? Barrett is fine?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, great. I talked with my students earlier in the term, and I am recording now, by the way, about respectful forms of address, and that you start with the highest level form of address that somebody wants, that somebody's entitled to, unless they tell you they're comfortable being addressed differently. Okay, so I'll refer to you as Barrett throughout. Thank you for your time, because I know that time is scarce and that we are all under stress on all sides of the teaching equation. I thought that since we're acquainted, it would be more interesting for us to talk about your work than for me to lecture to my students about your work. Like, I can't have Kant on for a recorded Zoom thing, but we can chat. So hopefully the students who are watching this have at least had a chance to scan your paper already. If not, this will still be a good kind of primer before they get started. So what drove you to write Love and Resistance?
Well, thanks, let me say at the start, for having me. I'm really glad to get to chat with you, and I really am glad that your students are reading my paper. It means a lot to me. I wrote this paper coming out of having lots of conversations with students of my own as they were getting ready to go home for Thanksgiving in particular, and have conversations, checking in with family who, they might not have gone home earlier in the semester, and so that might be the first time that they were getting caught up. And I've had a lot of students over the years come to office hours and say, look, I've been taking this class about justice, either racial justice or gender justice or environmental justice, and I've learned all this stuff, and it's affected the way that I perceive the world, and it's affected the way that I perceive my loved ones, people in my family, and what maybe is going on for them when they make an offhand comment about politics, or when they make a comment, they tell a joke, or they laugh at a joke and then ask why I'm not laughing, and ask why can't I take a joke. And so I wrote this paper because I was thinking about the conversations that I'd had with them over the years, and thought that maybe it would be useful to explore some of those themes in a way that might be widely accessible. All that said, I also want to stress that for me, I think I'm doing philosophy here. I think I'm advancing a larger theory, specifically in what we would think of as moral psychology. So thinking about what anger is and what it means and what it can do for us when we are all walking around in or living in the world in these larger ideologies, or what I like to think of as these social level stories that we tell ourselves about how the world is and how it ought to be. So for me, the paper is really thinking about how to navigate all of that and to navigate those relationships with loved ones, because I think that although any kind of political disagreement can feel threatening or challenging or painful, that kind of disagreement with people that we love can be especially painful and can present its own set of challenges. And so that's what I wanted to try to grapple with here.
So if there were sort of one bit of your paper or one concept that you really hope people took away, because there's a lot in here that we could take away, right? There's just one bit that you really hoped that readers would take away, what would it be?
Yeah, so it's that point I was making, just kind of referencing just a minute ago, about the significance of anger and its relationship to love. That I think some of the time we maybe think about anger as being a bad thing, or anger as like you shouldn't be mad at people that you love, or love and anger are incompatible with each other. And not only do I think that that's not true, I think sometimes love requires anger, or it calls for it. That it's specifically within loving relationships that demand a particular kind of response from us that anger is the appropriate response. Now, just to be really clear, there are all kinds of ways that the expression of anger can be immoral or inappropriate, that if you yell at someone or fly off the handle in expressing your anger, that might be totally wrong for you to do. I'm not saying that all expressions of anger are compatible with love. I think some are clearly not. But I do think that love and anger themselves really can live in the same house, and that love can call for an anger response. Um, Part of that for me is grounded, as I talk about in the paper, in P.F. Strawson's recognition that we can either be angry that something happened, or we can be angry with a particular person for committing wrongful actions.
Mm.
And so I like to think about a distinction is between, if you're angry that a lightning bolt struck your house and burned it to the ground, like you're angry and devastated that that happened, but you aren't angry with the lightning bolt in the same way that you would be angry with an arsonist who intentionally burned your house down. And the distinction between that anger with and anger that helps to reveal something important about like what is on the scene morally. And the difference between the two cases is that with the arsonist, you're dealing with a moral agent. And with the lightning bolt, you're dealing with a state of affairs or a naturally occurring event. And so to tie all this back to love and the way that anger can exist within a loving relationship, and that in fact the loving relationship can call for anger, is that when I become angry with a loved one, part of what I'm doing is recognizing that they are themselves a moral agent and can go in a new way, that they don't have to continue to commit that wrongful action. So if my uncle at dinner says something racist or says something homophobic and I become angry with him, part of what I'm doing is recognizing that he's a person rather than a thing. And I'm expecting him to go in a new way, to really confront those parts of his inner life, which we all have, that are ongoing works in progress, and expecting him to really make good on his potential and to work to become a better person.
So this is one of the papers that I reread pretty frequently, not just when I'm teaching it, but also at other times when I find myself struggling with the issue. And on one of my rereads, I had a thought that I hadn't had before about it. And that thought was that I had just recently at that point experienced something where someone that I am in a relationship with, not a romantic one, just a family one, where they said something quite appalling. And I just sighed on the inside. I wasn't angry. And I realized that I had lost faith in their ability to change. That resignation and the lack of anger was a sign that something had shifted in the way I thought of them as a moral agent who's open to reason and development, right? Namely, that I no longer thought they were. And this was kind of devastating for me. And so one of the things you talk about is the need to maintain relationships because we want people we love to grow. But if I've reached the point where I think somebody can't grow, then what? Do I just sort of sit with my weird, disappointing Zen feeling that they can't change and I'll just, keep my relationship with them, but I won't try to change them anymore? Or is it still on me to try to summon up that belief that they can change? What do you think?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a hard one that's not going to have a one-size-fits-all answer. But I do think that part of what you're pointing to, just in talking, like you described it as a feeling of disappointment. And I contrast anger with disappointment in the paper. And I also just, think about times where someone has said to you, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. and how, at least for me, that felt really bad in a way that someone being angry with me might also feel bad. But disappointment was like a special kind of feeling.
Yeah.
And I think part of what that conveys is the resignation that you've described, just giving up on someone and saying, like, to learn that the other person has given up on me in that way is really unpleasant. Um, all that said, I take it that your question is about how we are to navigate our responsibilities to our loved ones and when we're supposed to, like, is it ever okay to stop? Is it ever okay to to not insist that they become better, more complete people? And I mean, I think the answer is definitely yes, that there are times where it might be perfectly okay for you to do that. I think we have strong obligations to ourselves to take care of ourselves and preserve our own well-being. And so if, for instance, continuing to feel anger for a loved one becomes unhealthy for you or dangerous for you, then I think you got to let go of that anger. You got to do what you need to do. But that's still, I think, a little bit different than the case that you're describing, which is
Yeah.
not like you're not feeling that disappointment because it's bad for you to remain angry, but you're feeling that disappointment because you really have reached a point where, at least with regard to that part of your loved one's life, they're more like the lightning bolt than they are the arsonist. They're more like an event rather than a person. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, yeah, to some degree. And then so really my concern is it on them to restore themselves to agency in my eyes, or is it on me to restore them to agency in my eyes? Like, do I have an obligation to try to step back and go, oh crap, like I've been seeing them as an object, not an agent. I need to restore my sense of them as a morally responsible person. You know? And I guess one of the reasons that I've been thinking about this a lot lately is that I'm really glad that I have not been put in a position where I feel that I need to cut somebody out of my life because they're so morally toxic. But I know people who have done that, right? We have, without naming any names, we have adult friends in common, you and I, who have permanently cut one of their parents out of their lives because that parent was so not wrong in the way they treat other people, though that too, right? But wrong in the way they treated the person who decided to do the cutting. And so this raises another issue, which is what about, like, a lot of the examples in your paper are when people are morally wrong about racism, right, or issues of injustice. We see this happening a lot today with people cutting each other out of their lives over who does and does not support the current president of the United States and why and to what degree, right? But what about when the moral wrong is the wrong that the other person is doing to us, right? I mean, this is also an issue of self-protection. And I think it's a really core issue about love and resistance to injustice when the injustice is to us.
Absolutely. And so for me, that sounds like a much more clear case of that self-regarding obligation to take care of yourself, to further your own welfare, or to not allow yourself to be further harmed or wronged by somebody else in your life. And like that's always going to be I mean, this is controversial in contemporary ethics, as many things are, but for me it's just like obviously and clearly true that if that you owe things to yourself, and it's not just like that it's okay for you to prioritize your own welfare, that you positively have a moral obligation to prioritize your welfare, and in lots of situations it's not, as I said, a one size fits all universal thing. Sometimes you should prioritize someone else's welfare over your own. But if it's a situation where a loved one just is wronging you in a way that's really significant and harmful, then I think you very well might have an obligation to exit that relationship, to no longer have that person be in your life. That doesn't mean that you ought to regard them or think that other people should regard them as a non-agent.
Mhm.
And in fact, I think it's precisely because of their agency that the fact that they're choosing to continue to be wrongful, to commit wrongful actions or to harm you in those ways, that you might think, because of that, I'm going to leave. I've given you the opportunity, like you've had the chance to change your ways, and you've demonstrated an unwillingness to do so, an unwillingness to make amends or moral repair. And so for that reason, I'm going to have to exit this relationship. I think that that's not only permissible, but obligatory a lot of the time.
For my students, that will tie in with the article you read by Carol Hay on obligations we have to ourselves to resist oppression,
Yeah.
because we are rational beings and we have to preserve that respect and demand that respect.
Absolutely.
Ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, all of this is vaguely Kantian, right? Like there are Kantian themes running throughout all of this for sure.
Yeah, I think you could also make certainly a virtue argument that it's excessive moral generosity to others to allow them to trample over you again and again, right?
Definitely.
And you could make a rule utilitarian argument as well as act utilitarian, that there's just too much suffering in allowing these kinds of repeated patterns to continue, right? It's one thing if it's a one-off, right? You could say act utilitarian, that's bad, but I should still probably continue this relationship, right? It's another thing if it goes on. So I think sometimes about like my kids, and they have a little bit of sibling rivalry. Shocker, sibling rivalry. And I imagine what it would be like if that continued on at the same level that it sometimes is now that they're kids into adulthood. And I could see one of them feeling and perhaps being justified and saying like, look, dude, until you start being more routinely nice to me, until our relationship is not characterized by you trying to provoke me and get a rise out of me and trolling me at every opportunity, right? We're just not going to do this anymore, you know? And that seems like the kind of thing that is not the sort of atomic bomb of personal relationships like abuse, right? But it's the everydayness of when relationships get hard. And I think that's what I appreciate about your article here. It's about the everydayness of things that we really struggle with. And so many papers in ethics, even on social justice, are about like the atomic bomb issues, like how should we structure societies? And this is, what about when you disagree with people you love about how we should structure societies, right? Among other things. There was another thing I was thinking.
Can I just jump in there real quick?
Absolutely.
So just to follow up on your point, I mean, one of the other things that I explore in the paper, or one of the points that I make is that I think one of the things that love requires is a willingness to play the long game with someone. And so part of that, like the way that I talk about it in the paper, is recognizing like having hard conversations with someone who has a problematic inner life, that like you're not going to have magic bullet conversations where if they just read one article or watch one documentary, then they're going to get it. But I think, so like, in other words, being willing to have those conversations play out over time, like we do in a semester, where we've got a lot of time to slowly process big and challenging ideas. That's part of what love requires and playing the long game means. But I also think that it means to use your kids' the example of your kids, you might say, look, in this situation, I'm not going to be done with you. I'm not going to cut you out of my life in some kind of, really final sense.
Mm-hmm.
But I am going to say that you're being a jerk right now. Like you're being somebody that isn't healthy for me to have in my life. And I'm going to not have you be an active contributor to my life until you're willing to demonstrate that you're going to knock it off and treat me differently. And that also seems perfectly compatible with the demands of love to me, that you might be willing to say to someone, I'm not going to give up on you. I'm not going to cut you out, but I'm also not going to tolerate this type of harmful behavior. And so when you are game to knock it off, then we can talk.
Uh-huh.
But until that point, I got to take care of myself, and I have other things I have to attend to and a life to live. Does that
Yeah,
seem like your
yeah,
view?
absolutely. And that made me start thinking also about romantic relationships,
Mm,
um, and long-term romantic relationships, where part of what you're doing is trying to grow together into people who can, at a minimum, stand each other for a long period of time, right?
mhm,
And some people are lucky; they start off in a good place, but they'll change, and then they'll have to come back together, and it takes work. And I've often thought of how interesting it is that a lot of like the scripts that we get for how to do relationships from movies end
mhm,
with the wedding, right? Or they begin with a divorce and falling in love with somebody else and then end with a wedding, right? And we don't get these good scripts for how it is that you can be really mad at somebody and still love them,
yeah.
and like your madness isn't a sign that divorce is pending, right? It's a sign that you're asking for something to shift,
Mhm,
right? And so that made me think about how some of the examples we've been using are things that people believe or say, right? Or do. But I'm also thinking about now when we're upset because of things that people don't do and we think they ought to be doing, right?
mhm,
Showing us more affection, or uh, more equal division of labor is a thing that often comes up in heterosexual relationships, right? Um, and people get angry about that, and sometimes justifiably. And so I know that your paper is mostly about what to do when we kind of feel angry, right? And seeking moral solidarity and helping others to grow. But one thing I often think about is, what do we do when people are angry at us? Like, what's the right response there? So, what is the right response when people are angry at us?
That's a really good question. So I think, especially now, we see in so-called call-out culture and a world where uh, tensions are very high along various political lines, that it can be very striking to have, especially on social media, people pile on, and all of a sudden you're cast out of society, and what's to be done with you. Um, I think that both in that type of public facing sense, but then also within the confines of just a two-person relationship, when one person tells you that they're angry with you, or when 1,000 people tell you that they're angry with you, the first step always has to be to listen and to try to understand what the charge being leveled against you is. So when the other person is expressing anger, as I understand anger in the paper and more generally, anger is going to smuggle in cognitive content. It has a, a particular judgment that is built into it. So when I'm angry with the arsonist, part of what I'm doing is simultaneously recognizing the arsonist as an agent. I'm recognizing their action as wrongful, and I'm recognizing myself as someone who can be wronged and who has moral value. So I'm saying, in quotes, I'm saying a lot of things when I
Mhm.
express anger towards someone for their wrongful behavior.
Right.
If I express anger towards my partner for an unequal distribution of household chores, like I'm doing the dishes way more than my partner is, part of what I'm doing is both recognizing them as someone who could be doing the dishes more and has fallen down on the job, but I'm also recognizing, look, like I shouldn't have to carry a disproportionate burden in this, in our domestic life, that this is the kind of thing that we should share as a couple, as opposed to having it all fall on me. And of course, typically it's going to run in the other direction, where household chores fall on women in a hetero relationship. But just to use that as an example. So if my partner gets mad at me for not doing the dishes, then I think what I need to do is say, okay, like that anger is expressing propositional content. There's a judgment there. And the judgment is likely saying a bunch of different things. And I need to work to get clear about what it is that it's communicating. And so that's going to involve a lot of, active listening to my partner who's expressing that anger. It's going to try to empathize with the other person. And I think a lot of the time when we talk about empathy, we say it's putting yourself in the other person's shoes, but I don't think that's right. I think that empathy is trying to get really clear about what it is for them to be in their shoes, because of the significance of our social location, where we find ourselves in the social world. If I put myself as a middle-aged white man professional in the position of someone else, it's often going to be easy for me not to get why what was just said was, offensive or hurtful, or why an experience might have been felt as threatening or something along those lines. So real empathy is trying to get outside of myself and experience things or perceive things from the position of the other. And in this case, the other who is suggesting that I've acted wrongly, and to really try to get my arms around what's going on for them. And that is the only way I'm going to have that information, is going to be through listening or through talking with other people who might be in a position to help me process all of that. But then I also have to make a decision for myself about whether their charge against me is appropriate, whether their anger is righteous. And because sometimes people are mad at each other when they shouldn't be. And sometimes, like, the fact that anger is often going to have that judgment built into it doesn't mean the judgment's always accurate. And so this is an unsatisfying answer at the end of the day, but it's just the messiness of everyday moral life, is that you have to adjudicate, you have to decide, okay, in this particular case, this person is telling me that they're angry with me for a thing that I've done. Let me learn about what charge is being leveled against me, and then I'm going to have to decide for myself whether they're right. And if they're right, then we're on to the next stage of making amends for it. But that's a whole other conversation.
Well, and that's what you referred to before as moral repair, right? The work of moral repair, which for my students is a whole other subset of ethical theory. And there's a lot of great stuff on that out there. What do we do when we've ruptured and damaged each other in our moral relations? How do we come back from that, right? Yeah. And so if I were an Aristotelian virtue ethicist, I might say, oh, look, Barrett, it sounds like you're describing humility. You need the virtue of humility in response to people being angry at you, insofar as being angry is often levying charges at you. Mm-hmm. You need to be like, what if they've got a point? What if I am not perfect in every possible way? Right? What if I have limits as a human being and I tripped over them in these cases?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been emphasizing in my ethics course is how these ethical theories are toolkits and they can help us see things. Yeah. So virtue ethics just helped me see a particular thing. Earlier we were talking about Kantian ideas of obligation. That can help us see some things too, right? And utilitarianism can help us be attuned to the suffering and joy of people who aren't us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And those aren't the only options out there, but they're the options that we often focus on in ethics courses. So I guess my final question for you is based on the fact that I have information that my students don't about you, which is that I know for a fact that you've continued to develop this project and the issues that you're concerned with. So have you changed your mind on anything from this article, or expanded and developed other things that you didn't touch on in this article?
Yeah, so I've continued to think about these themes in a number of different ways. One of them is in a recent paper of mine that's about to come out, thinking about a relationship between, again, love and, in this case, social justice activism. So when we hear about various social movements invoking the concept of love, or when you see those signs in people's front yards that say things like, in this house, love wins, like, what should we make of that? It was the kind of motivating question for this most recent paper of mine. And one of the things that I have ended up doing, and if I were to return to Love and Resistance and write it today, I would spend more time talking in particular about, like, it was important to me when writing it that it not be either romantic or that it be non-romantic. I just want to talk about when you feel the burdens of love, the demands of love, like, what is that going to look like? So I didn't want to be overly restrictive there. But I do think if I could come back to it, I would spend more time unpacking the concept of agape love, which, and I've been reading a lot of Martin Luther King lately, and King specifically develops the concept of agape as a type of redemptive, creative love in which we recognize what he thought of as the spark of divinity in all people, and which you can either be theistic about it and think in terms of the spark of divinity, or I think you could be more secular and recognize the fact of agency. And part of what it is to grapple with our being agents, persons rather than things, what that means is that people can always choose to go a new way, that it's always open to someone, even when they've done horrific things in their past. Part of what recognizing the fact of agency involves is understanding that someone can always choose something new in every moment. And part of what agape style love requires of us is recognizing that fact and then hoping and pressing someone to make good on that agential potential, which is certainly going to be the name of my band one day. So I would spend more time, as I have recently, and as I'm also doing I've currently co-authoring a couple of projects with our friend Audrey Yap, and the larger project that we're working on is called Not Giving Up on People. And the motivating idea is that we should try to build a world in which society doesn't give up on people and create space for them to make good on that agential potential that they have. That doesn't mean that any individual person shouldn't give up on someone. Like in the examples we were giving a few minutes ago, if a person has really wronged me, then I might just need to be done with them. And I might even need to regard them as a thing rather than as a person. But I don't think society should be arranged in that way. And I think, unfortunately, today, a lot of our social arrangements are set up to give up on people. I think that's what mass incarceration is. I think we resign people to a state of like being set in their past wrongs, as opposed to recognizing their potential for the future. And so that's the direction that our research is taking right now, and that mine is taking in particular.
Yeah, I appreciate this idea that people aren't disposable, right? And it reminds me also of a distinction related to the calling out part, right? Which is calling in, which is calling out is like, you did this thing. I'm like pointing at the audience. Sorry, guys. You did this thing. I can't believe you did this thing, right? And the kind of anger you talk about in the paper, Love and Resistance, is very much that kind of anger, right? And calling out can be alienating, and it can sometimes seem, especially between strangers, to be treating somebody as disposable. But calling in is where you go, dude, you can do better. Come here. Right? Let me show you why that was not a good thing to do, and here's what you could have done differently. Okay? And it's much less disposable. And the person who first formulated the idea of calling in versus calling out was thinking specifically of how not to treat people who want to help as disposable, Like if they don't help perfectly, we're done with them, right?
Right.
Yeah, and for people who didn't grow up in a Christian culture, they may not know the word agape. Either at like a secular ancient Greek philosophy culture or a Christian culture. But agape is A-G-A-P-E, and it refers to this kind of brotherly love for our fellow humans, right? So that's talking about people that we aren't in these close personal relationships with. So you're expanding then from the close personal relationships to the kind of brotherly love.
That's right, but I also think that, so certainly King was talking in terms of social groups and how they regard other social groups, and that was a motivating orientation for the civil rights movement. But I think that same type of orientation, where you recognize the redemptive potential in all agents, certainly also manifests in intimate personal relationships. So although the love that I have for a friend of mine or my sister is particular in a way that agape might be more generalized, the underlying content of agape, I think, also ought to play out. Anywhere agency's on the scene and love is on the scene, then part of what that love is going to involve is recognizing that someone can always go in a new way. And as Jean Harvey said, I think I quote in the paper, that we're all fellow travelers living lives of moral endeavor, and none of us are perfect, and all of us have a long way to go. And I think that that's part of what King is after when he's thinking about agape, is an expectation, a demand that people be better than their past selves. And that just involves not giving up on them, not throwing them away or treating them as disposable, but believing that they have potential to grow beyond their past mistakes.
Yeah. I think that's a really good note to end on.
Okay.
All right. Thank you for your time. I will end the recording now, and we can chat a little more afterwards if you'd like.
Thanks everyone for reading my work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time.